So now I'm just gonna start pulling this thing apart. Oh, there it goes.
There you go.
One awesome thing that we did get for the Corvette is some QA1 coilovers. Alright, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Rusted Mod. We are back in the new shop and we're going to start on our first project in here, which is the C3 Corvette you see behind me. This thing has been off the road for 20 years. We put the entire interior of the car together and we got it back on the road. We got it fired up in a previous episode. I'll link up here and you can see all the progress of this thing. Since then, we have noticed that this thing has kind of developed a tick whenever it gets up to operating temperature. So I'm thinking that it's a lifter. So what we're gonna do is yank the intake off this thing and check it out. Maybe it's something else, I'm not really sure, but it sounds a lot like a collapsed lifter in there. So I got some new lifters we could throw in this thing and hopefully get this thing back on the road. I also have some other upgrades for this that will help the suspension and the stance of this thing a little bit. And we got to finish up some tedious interior things as well. So first thing we gotta do is tackle these lifters. So let's get to it. All right, first thing, pull it outside, draining all the coolant out. One, because I'm replacing the radiator. Two, because the intake is full of coolant. Alright, so now I'm just going to start pulling this thing apart. I got to pull the distributor off, going to pull the intake off, pull the carburetor off. Gonna put this thing at top dead center, that way I can know the distributor is lined up in the correct spot when I put it all back together. So, just starting to dig into this thing. Okay, so I got the distributor pretty close to be pointed at number 1 cylinder, so that way I know we're at TDC and I can pull the distributor out and it won't affect anything. So, gonna start pulling the carburetor off and pull the hoses and stuff off and yank this intake off. There it goes.
There you go.
Well, got the intake off. Luckily, everything looks pretty good in here. It looks like someone had pulled this intake off already, so kind of wondering why they did that. Maybe they just upgraded the intake manifold to that Edelrock one that was on here. We got the intake off, gonna pull these valve covers off, and then we can really see what these lifters look like on the inside. Alright guys, got all the lifters and push rods and everything pulled out of the Corvette. So the first thing I'm going to do is start by just plopping the lifters in there. But I have some assembly lube, going to put all over the new lifters, and that way we'll be good to stick them in. Alright, got all the new lifters put in there. Time to start reassembling the top end and put all the rocker arms and push rods, and then we can go ahead and lash the valves. Should be ready to put everything else together. I got all the rocker arms tightened down, so now I gotta lash the valves. So how I'm gonna do that is basically I'm going to tighten all the rocker arm bolts snug until this push rod doesn't spin. And then once the push rod begins to tighten up, like it doesn't want to spin anymore, I'll stop and then move on to the next one. Then once I get the rest of them tightened down so they don't spin, I'll turn the motor over a quarter of a turn and then go and to the next one, make sure it's tight until they're all tight again, then turn the motor a quarter of a turn and keep doing that until I get to one rotation, make sure that they're all tight. Then spin the motor over again just to verify and make sure everything's good, and then we should be good and the valves should be lashed and we should be good enough to reassemble the rest of the motor. So gonna do that now, see how it goes. So that should get us pretty close to lashing the valves, but it should be pretty much good to go back together. So going to clean everything off and put the intake back on. I have a new distributor for it, but I'm waiting for it. So I'm probably gonna slap the old one in for now. That way we can make sure that everything is good to go. This thing was sitting in a garage for a long time and this thing kind of looks a little bit chewed up. Gonna replace that so that way we don't have any other problems, but it will work just to fire this thing back up. All right guys, got the intake on, it's torqued down, just threw the distributor in there, made sure that we're lined up back to TDC, kind of orientate the distributor to the number one cylinder. It looks like it's pretty close. I did rotate it around a few times when we lashed the valves. So we should be able to put the distributor on, put the carburetor on, and put the valve covers back on, hook everything back up, try to fire this thing up. All right guys, I've been tinkering away at the Corvette and I got it kind of put together. Show you guys what I did. But I did get the new valve covers on and it looks pretty good. So I got the new valve covers on, I got the intake back on, got the distributor in, I got it set to top dead center, and I got the distributor kind of positioned as close as I could get it to where it was. Just need to throw the carburetor on, hook all the fuel lines up and all the coolant system back up, and we should be ready to start this thing and see how it sounds. All right, so we got the motor pretty much assembled. The only thing that I'm waiting on is a new distributor. I put the old one in and this thing is completely falling apart. Looks like a mouse has gotten in here and chewed up all these wires and then ended up all these connectors broke that go into the distributor. So since the distributor is kind of jank, I'm just gonna wait. I have a new one coming and then I'll just put that in and then we can try to fire this thing up for the first time. It looks like we have all the valves set and they look like they're pretty decent. I did spin the motor over just to pump some oil through everything to make sure that everything was getting lubricated, and it looks like it's pretty good. Valves are opening and closing good. Everything looks pretty nice. So waiting on a distributor and then we can button this thing up and try to fire it up. One awesome thing that we did get for the Corvette is some QA1 coilovers. Guys over at QA1 wanted us to have some of these on the nice Corvette here, and this is kind of a big deal for me. I've usually just had cheap Chinese coilovers, or I've just heated up springs and drove it like that, or just done some jank stuff. But for this car behind me, we wanted the nicest parts on it, so we got some QA1 coilovers for this thing and I am so excited to put them on. So I spoke to the guys over at QA1 and trying to figure out what kind of the best setup for this thing is, and we ended up deciding that a single adjustable coilover kit would probably work the best for this thing. It's not necessarily a track monster or anything like that. We're just trying to cruise it around. We do have some adjustability if we do want to do some spirited driving, and it'll improve the ride quality of this thing dramatically. So we do have single adjustable coilovers, and I'm really excited to get this thing installed on the Corvette. It'll, one, make the ride height fixed, and it will improve the ride quality and have some adjustability that we wouldn't have in 1979 when this thing was built. So let's get this Corvette up in the air, install this stuff, and we can get the ride height set, and then we can put it on the ground and see how this thing looks. Then we can wait for that distributor to come in, plop it in there, get the thing running, and see how these things handle. All right, so we got the Corvette up on the quick jacks, so you can see how high this thing can go. We can pull all the suspension off, all the wheels off and everything. If you have a regular garage, it's a lot easier. You can literally get underneath the whole thing, build an exhaust, pull a transmission, whatever you got to do under the car, and it's a few feet up. So much better than jack stands and a lot quicker. So now we're just going to start ripping this thing apart and trying to get the coilovers on, and then we can finally set it down and see what the ride height looks like. I'm gonna start on the coilovers on this thing. Basically, we just need to take the entire knuckle and everything that's connected to it loose from the car, so that way we can drop the lower control arm down and then get the spring and the shock out of underneath the car. So I'm gonna start by pulling the caliper off, then I'm going to pull the ball joint off on the top, and I have to disconnect the sway bar and then get all that stuff out of the way, drop this thing down, and I should be able to pop the spring out. I actually already did the other side, so I kind of know how it goes now. I ended up taking the tie rod off on the other side and not even needing to do that. So gonna do that real quick, and then we can try to pull the spring out and put the new QA1 coilover back in. All right, got the upper control arm off of the knuckle. So now we have to unbolt the shock, and this thing should probably drop down pretty good. So there's two bolts on the bottom of the shock. I'm gonna take those out, one on the top. This thing should come down. All right, it took me a second to get that shock bolt out, but you can see the control arm is down. I can access the spring here, and the shock is out. All right, took me a second to get the lower control arm out. I got the shock out. Kind of a little bit difficult to get in there, but you get the top of the bolt out, and then you get the two on the bottom. The whole bottom A-arm will drop down, and you should be able to remove the coil spring. So that slides right out. And now you're ready to begin assembling the QA1 stuff. Now, clean the inside of where the spring is going to mount. So these are actually weld nuts on here, and we're going to have to basically break those off to be able to get the bolts through. So basically what I did on the other side was I threaded in the old bolt to give you some leverage, and then I just tap it and it breaks it right off. Pretty easy. So do that on the other side, and then I'll show you guys what else you got to do. So now I'm going to drill out these two holes so that way we can fit the bolts through. Not a whole lot needs to be opened up, just a little bit. If you have a step bit, it'd probably be a little bit better, but just open these up a little bit so we can clearance for the bolt holes, and then slide them right up in there, and it should work out pretty good. All right, so we got our QA1 coilovers here, reading through the instructions, just making sure. You want to put anti-seize on the threads before you assemble these things. Basically, what we're going to do is we have this locking ring that's going to go down first, and that's going to lock against this ring that you're going to put on, and this is going to basically set your ride height of what you want the car to sit at. And then you'll thread that all the way down, and then whenever you go to install it, you'll install it basically how we installed the shock, or the reverse of that. And this will go up through the top of the frame rail. You have to drill out the two welded nuts on the bottom, and that way you can fit the bolts that bolt the bottom of this. Then you'll put this on top of this. Once you put that in the control arm, slide the whole thing up and bolt it in whenever you bolt the knuckle down. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. So let's go through these in. So now we can go ahead and install our fancy new QA1 coilover in here. And basically what we're gonna do is we're just going to bolt it straight down to the control arm there. And then we got our bolts that we clearance, feed them up through the bottom, and then stick a nut on it. That's pretty much it. Do the same thing on the other side. And then probably the best way to do it is to get a floor jack, lift the whole thing up. We're going to feed the top of the shock into where the old shock went, tighten that up, and then just kind of backtrack of what you just did. put everything back together, and then we can go ahead and figure out what we're going to do with the back suspension, lower the thing down, and then set our ride height. Alright, and just like that, the new calipers on the QA1 coilovers are installed and the front suspension is done. Now, moving on to the back. So on the rear of a Corvette, the coilovers aren't the easiest thing to be able to put on. Now, the C3s have a rear leaf spring, and if you guys know anything about Corvettes, the front of a C4, C5, C6, C7 all have leaf springs. Now, they started the rear leaf spring in the C2 where they integrated the independent rear suspension. The C3 and the C2 rear suspension are very similar, but the front suspension is a lot easier on a C3. It's just a coil spring suspension like normal GM cars in the 60s and 70s. So the rear is a little bit different. So to do coilovers on a rear, you got to spend a ton of money and get control arms and relocate a bunch of stuff, and it's just really not necessary for this car at this moment to be able to do all that stuff. But I do want to match the front ride height with the rear ride height, and what we're going to do is basically they have a bolt that bolts the suspension to this leaf spring, and basically what you're going to do is lengthen this bolt so that way the suspension is lower, but it will lower the ride height of the vehicle by lengthening that bolt. So I know it's not really the best way to do it, but it's going to be the way we're going to go for now. I eventually want to upgrade this rear leaf spring. This is still the steel leaf spring, and do a more modern Corvette leaf spring in the rear and do some shocks and stuff like that. But for now, just to get the ride height where we want it, I'm going to do the bolt, and basically what we have to do is pull this out, put a new one in that's a little bit longer, and then let it down, and the rear is lowered. All right, we finally got the wheels and tires back on the C3, so time to lower it down and see what this ride height looks like. All right, guys, well, we lowered the car down and the front actually sits pretty nicely. Now, this car is going to settle, so I probably am going to have to raise it up a little bit. But as it sits currently, that's kind of what I was looking for. Right where the fender meets the top of the tire is pretty much where I prefer this car to sit. It's not slammed or anything, but it's nice stance and it's a nice driver quality where it's not super jacked up, but it's low enough where it looks like it's pretty cool. Now, the rear, it looks like the lowering bolts are too low. I just barely threaded them on, but what's happening is I think this bolt is too low and the leaf spring's actually hitting the inside of the wheel here, causing it to not be able to go down enough. So what I'm going to do is tighten the bolt up, and then that should bring the car up, but it also should bring the leaf spring up away from the tire, because we definitely don't want that contacting anything. Same thing on the other side. So I'm going to try to tighten that up a little bit, roll the car back and forth to try to settle it, and see what that looks like. Now, hopefully we can get the distributor in soon, put that thing in here and drive this thing and actually get it to settle down and see what it's gonna look like. But for now, at least we kind of have an idea that it will be a little bit lower and it obviously will ride much nicer. All right, guys, it's been a few days, but we're back on the C3. I finally got the new distributor in, and we can go ahead and put that thing in and hopefully fire this thing up. You guys saw we got our QA1 coilovers on there. We tried to lower the back, still has to settle. So it looks a little bit wonky right now, but we can't drive it and let that thing settle because we don't have a distributor. So I just pulled out the old distributor. So you can see this thing has seen better days. All these wires are getting ready to break off. So I figured, why not just replace the whole thing? So got a new one in finally. So I have the motor at top dead center, so we can go ahead and try to put the new one in the car, and then hopefully this thing will fire up.
Quiet.
Yeah. All right, finally got the Corvette back up and running. Sorry, I know this video is all over the place. We've been jumping back and forth on different projects and moving stuff around and going on one project and then going on another, but finally got this thing running. So I had my dad come down and help me just adjust the valves and then set the timing and stuff because it was kind of hard to do it by myself. So we got the thing all set up and it runs fantastic. So I went ahead and slapped the new valve covers on. So we got the new valve covers on. We got the timing set, should be pretty close. We haven't gotten up to operating temp because, as you remember, I drained the coolant out of this because we did the lifters and I wanted to change this radiator. So that's the next thing we got to do, change the radiator. And whenever we did the coilovers, I had taken the caliper off, so I need to bleed the brakes. So bleed the brakes, change the radiator, then we can finally drive this thing under its own power and see what these QA1 coilovers feel like. And we have to adjust them based on the parameters of the car. So as you can see, I pushed the car in and out a few times and it sat down a little bit more. Obviously, when we drive it, it'll settle. So I'm probably going to raise it up a little bit, but I want to try to drive it and see what it does. So we're going to drive this thing and hopefully I can get everything set up on the suspension and the back suspension as well. So we're going to pull the radiator out and try to get this thing drivable. All right, got the radiator pulled out. This one has just seen better days. Felt more comfortable just changing it. Looks pretty old. So we got a new one for this thing, a new aluminum one. And just if you guys have C3s, just know that they collect a ton of junk up underneath of this thing because all the air comes through from the bottom. So all the road debris and everything else, you got to keep these things clean or they will overheat. So just keep that in mind. But now we got the old radiator out, we can go ahead and put in the new radiator, fill this thing up with coolant, get this thing to operating temperature, and we should be ready to go. Take this thing on its first drive. All right, got our new radiator here, switched over the transmission cooler lines, and this is the old one. So slap this thing in here, get everything buttoned back up, and should be ready for a test drive. Guys, first major drive in the C3. This thing's running pretty good. It's shifting good. It don't hear any lifter tick and it handles really good. It's actually really cool how well this car handles. All right guys, we got the C3 running, driving, and handling, and it runs really good. And the coilovers are super nice. This thing handles like it should, like a Corvette, and it doesn't have a horrible lifter clatter anymore. It rides really good, and it sounds much better. Before, you would just hear that horrible lifter clatter when it's going down the road. Now that the suspension has settled a little bit, this thing has the right stance. It might need to go up a smidge in the front, and I'd like the back to go down probably another inch just to match the front, but as it is, it's much better than what it was. This thing looked like a monster truck before, and now it actually looks like a sports car. So I'm super happy with the way this car came out. I'm really happy with the coilovers. Check out QA1 Suspension. These guys really know what they're doing. It's awesome to be able to find an affordable coilover for an old classic car like this. The rear suspension actually handles pretty good with the lowering bolts. I'm really kind of satisfied with the way it is right now. So we'll probably just leave that for now. And we have no more lifter clatter. This thing runs really good. And it's a perfect cruiser for the car show season that's coming up. Now, I do want to try to do some handling stuff with this car one day and maybe try it on Hot Rod Power Tour, do some autocross, and see how this thing does. So that's going to do it for this episode, guys. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe so you can stay up to date on all the projects we have in here. Hope you guys like the Corvette content. We have a little bit more stuff that we're going to do with this thing in the coming weeks. So make sure you look out for that and all the other projects here we have on Russomod. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.